I never quite know what that does to our behavior, whether that makes us more quiet or more outlandish, but don't worry about it. I'm not quite sure who would want to watch it, but we've been asked to hang on to these in case somebody, I don't know, I guess something, at any rate. All right, so that's a little bit of a reminder about where we are. Please feel free to ask questions and use the chat box or speak up. I clearly have an ability to talk a good bit. But that doesn't need to be the only way we get to content around this. So, as I said, welcome back to the series. Today we get to talk about values, and we get to talk about human resource capacity and services and supports and accountability. The closing session in June will really be around what next as we move forward. The title in this is about keeping the values in as you build out. Why? Because when we start to, it's one of the things you see in almost any innovation, I think, particularly innovations in the human service field. There is typically a value base and clarity about message and intent at the beginning. As we see innovations take hold and become more accepted, those innovations have to struggle with variation across settings. And Wraparound's been doing that for decades now, particularly, and so we have conversation about fidelity that emerges. And as innovations become typicalized, normalized, the challenge becomes, particularly in Wraparound's sake, how do you keep kind of the driving purpose and values in the work as you build out? Building out tends to leave us with structures and a sense of rigor and a sense of fixedness, when in the end Wraparound's been designed to be flexible, or to try to create capacity for flexibility for individual families and the plans that get attached to them in cross-system environments. I'm going to start at the bottom of the slide. The issue here isn't can we name these principles? The issue is what do we do with them? And how do we operationalize them kind of throughout this? And in the end, I wish things were simple, but I think they're complicated. I've put two sets of principles up here. One is the Wraparound principles, and I just realized that I left strength-based out of that list. There should be 10, my apologies, on the left, and on the right are system of care principles. If nothing else strikes you about them, I suspect they're familiar. They're words we use in program descriptions and grant applications and et cetera, and have for quite a while. The other thing that I suspect might strike you is that they're different, 6 and 10, but they're very similar in terms of the focus of them. Again, system of care principles are around the system of care movement and asking us to drive the development of our cross-system system of care around those principles. And Wraparound, in many ways, tries to operate like the oil or the glue that holds all of that together around the most complicated families and children in our systems. So I think having the principles and having an understanding of them is not terribly hard. The operationalization can be. Let's talk about the missing one for a moment from the Wraparound side, strength-based. Most of our organizations and most of our systems now do a very different and much more thorough job of identifying and engaging families through acknowledging their strengths than we've done historically. That's good. We document that information, we have it and hold it. You know, I sometimes acknowledge that I'm old enough now that I remember the day we put a line in our case record in the agency I was working at the time for strength, and it was about 2 lines long in a handwritten record, and we used to put like 1-word answers in. We're so proud of ourselves. But in the end, the struggle around strength-based is a couple of things. In terms of keeping the value in as you build Wraparound out, that occurs on a bunch of levels in my mind. One is it occurs around family teams and family plans. If we see strength in a family and in the team and the community around them, how do we actually use them in a Wraparound plan? And the technology, so to speak, the process of Wraparound tries to build some pathways for that at the family team level. But as we build Wraparound out into a cross-system environment where there are likely to be multiple doorways, I don't know if there'll be multiple doorways, there'll be multiple pathways to fund wraparound, have been and will continue to be, then strength-based gets to be interesting at a community level. What are the strengths of our community and how do they play to and how do we use them in our capacity to do this? I will spare you my temptation to talk about each of these because there's a lot of detail we can dig into about them. But the issue is that they're familiar, and I suspect they are useful to us both at the family level in terms of individual family plans, but also, as I said, at the organizational or at the community level. And that really is where this gets to be kind of an interesting soup as we think about it. So that, I think, is the challenge as we move forward. As always in this call today, based on what I can place about who's where, we have a fairly wide variation in participating counties in this call, from not a lot of wraparound capacity or experience to extensive wraparound capacity and experience. But I still think the value questions play, and they're going to continue to play as the next, I've been saying, 2 or 3 years, you know, as RISE, as FFPSA, as MSY, as those things continue to roll through our communities with their own kind of waves of change. We've got to figure out how these principles weave through that and how we make this work well for the notion of a broader cross-system system of care.
Neil?
The 3-part, yes, Dave.
I was just going to add real quick too, because I think one of the things that, as we've done our work here in Lucas County too, one of the things we've thought a lot about is how do we begin to look at integrating those values and how we just plain work with families across all the work we do across our systems. And I think that one of the things that, you know, everybody, you know, of course would shake their head. Of course I believe in those values, but operationalizing them is a whole different ball game, especially, you know, trying to really get those down deep into organizations too.
They're really simple terms of phrase, so to speak, that absolutely have implications at a bunch of layers. And as you were talking, Dave, I don't want to speak for the group, but for myself, and I thought probably a number of us think to ourselves, yep, if we could do that, we'd need less wraparound. We'd need less intensive, highly coordinated efforts for families with complicated needs, because the response would be different at the beginning of the process than it is. And that's kind of what this whole, you know, movement is after, whether we think about it as wraparound or system, but it's really about how do we get our community systems to work in a way that makes the need for deep end complicated things less likely. I'm not too worried about any of us ending up unemployed in the next few years. We haven't made that much progress about it, but it's a good goal and a good thing to remember. We're going to start this morning. There we go. We're going to start this morning with the staffing and HR issues. And this is, again, we have 90 minutes total today. This is not meant to be, nor can it be, an exhaustive review, so to speak, of every issue. But let's start with, in wraparound, there seem to be some staff roles emerging. Not seem to be. There are a number of clear staff roles that have emerged. The first that most imagine and are familiar with is the notion of a facilitator, sometimes called a care coordinator, sometimes called a wraparound coordinator, sometimes called any number of things. But that's a person who's responsible for managing and delivering the wraparound process around an individual load of families, so to speak, around a set of families. The National Wraparound Initiative has come forth and said that that should be somewhere in the 8 to 12, I think sometimes I see 15 families for a full-time equivalent facilitator to be able to do wraparound well, pointing to the intensity of effort, not just with the family, but with the team that it takes to do wraparound well. In all the different sites I've seen and heard about, one thing I can say is that they all have somebody who does this job. Now, who they are looks different in a variety of ways. You know, we've seen in Spokane, Washington, it was roughly 15 years ago now, might have been a little bit longer. the state of Washington rolled out and said, we will do, in the behavioral health care system at the time, they had just moved to some managed care constructs, and they said, we will make available to all customers the notion of individualized and tailored care, which was their word for wraparound. And they rolled it out and said, here you go. And if any of you have gotten to visit Washington and have a sense of the distance between Olympia on the far west coast and, for example, Spokane and the far eastern edge of the state, there's a lot of distance and a lot of dirt and some hills in between. And so the message from Olympia doesn't always get received as a, hot darn, let's go do that. And providers in Spokane hesitate. But the state had been providing lots of information to folks about wraparound. And so family members, parents in Spokane contacted the state office and said, we can't get our ITC. They say it's not available. And rather than the first thing I thought the state might have done, which was to come out and try to tap dance on the heads of providers and say, you have to do this, they said to the parents, let us equip you to do this for each other. And they sent trainers, myself and Pat Miles and others, to Spokane to work with that group of parents who developed the capacity to serve as many as 150 different families at a time, basically on a strictly voluntary basis with each other. They happened to have an organizer in their midst who appreciated getting things done, and she got connected to the community policing initiative so that families' teams were able to use community policing sites, storefronts across Spokane, where there were copy machines and things that would help them do the logistics of meeting together and communicating plans. And that's kind of on one end, so to speak, the place and the initiative that had family members facilitating for each other, but that also meant things around there wasn't a required education level, except for having had experience with your own son and daughter as a recipient in the care system, et cetera. On the other end, we've seen, if we try to jump to the other side of the continuum, we've seen highly credentialed and licensed staff out of juvenile justice, out of behavioral health, out of child welfare, out of developmental disabilities, out of individual systems, also take to this. And take to this meaning do wraparound as facilitators really well. Currently in our state, with wraparound attached mostly to FCFCs and sometimes to other organizations, there aren't strong boundaries around who has to be a facilitator. As we move to RISE, there will be a definition. And if you look at the draft rules, you'll be able to, around RISE, for example, you'll be able to see what those expectations are. But the point for me is reminding folks that no matter where you come from, whether it's as a parent who's been receiving services or as a highly experienced PhD social worker, wraparound will ask you to learn some new habits and some different ways of thinking about family, not family dynamics, but family needs and how you organize teams and responses. The second position that's emerged has been a family peer support partner. Again, there have been a number of titles around that. Parent peer support partner, family support partner. Some places have even been called the similar position family advocates. What those positions have at their core is they create a spot for a person who has lived through the experience of being a recipient of service in the service system. It creates a spot for folks with that experience to partner with and to be alongside and think about support as the primary function they have for parents and caregivers of youth who are involved in the wraparound process. Early wraparound efforts built this role in as a part of their staffing pattern. In the state of California, if you are a family receiving wraparound, you will meet a facilitator, a parent partner, a youth partner-like person. You will also meet a clinician, a mental health clinician, and those are all parts of the staff team that come with you in the way wraparound has designed this. In Ohio, we have the work that's gone out of the state folks and NAMI and the PAC, Parent Advocacy Connection work that's worked to make support partners available. We have a number of communities who built this position either into their wraparound or in a capacity or into their community system. some things to, so some have built it in, sometimes it's a standalone service at this point. It's also worth noting and remembering for those of you in the behavioral health system that peer support now exists around an adult recovery model and an adult and mental health recovery and around alcohol and drug addiction recovery. And one of the interesting things that makes those different from family peer support in the youth service world is that, typically, if you get to sit with peer supporters on the adult side, part of the story they share is the story of their own recovery. And it's the story of their own ability, which often includes a significant date. My recovery began when? And for parents in families that are living with complicated issues and behaviors, they typically don't have that recovery story. It's actually a very different kind of journey. So the peer support function isn't the same. There is training emerging around the family peer support partners nationally and in this state that's focused around the peer parent as opposed to the peer recovery resources or options. As we move forward, well, let me talk, I'm getting ahead of myself for a second. The youth peer partner is a third role that's also emerging at this point, which is a younger person, typically under 26, who is also in possession of lived experience, whose role it is to partner with youth in this process. So both a parent partner and a youth partner can have the capacity to come alongside the parent or the youth and be a support, which means what? Sharing the burden of having to go through this process, sharing the burden of having had similar experience. The role definition issues get interesting, and the organizational location of both the peer support, the parent peer support and youth peer support gets to be interesting, because when you have those positions, the richness of wraparound gets stronger because it's another perspective, because both of those positions tend to impact engagement for families and youth in the wraparound process in a positive way. But the other thing that comes up then is that you have two staff, a coordinator or a facilitator, and one or more peer partners working together around the same process, who will see families' stories differently. And the good news for facilitators is that's exactly what facilitators do, is to see and hear perspectives and find a way to begin to blend them so we can take action together as a team. But it also can have some strong implications for how the adult peer support partners and the parent peer support partners and the youth peer support partners and the facilitator communicate and how they get along. Just some things to think about. There also is a wraparound supervisor. People who do this work should receive supervision from someone who knows what wraparound's about and can help them negotiate the changing habits of needing to focus on doing wraparound as opposed to doing whatever brought them to the table. Typically, a wraparound supervisor oversees a unit. What's a unit? The span of control is typically thought of as less than 8 to 10 maybe. Responsible in terms of staff life, typically for having some input about everything from screening to hiring to onboarding to supervising to helping people transition away from the role. I mention this because as we've developed wraparound in this state, we have such a wide range of capacity in our counties for very good reasons, because we've not put together a single funding stream that makes it easy to track or do. But it does mean that we have people with various parts of their job trying to function both in the provider, in the facilitator role, and in the supervisor role, and that raises some challenges for us. Other roles, as you can see, I mentioned it can include, for example, a therapist, or sometimes there's a flexible staff person. I mean, the youth peer partner in California is not called that. It's called a child and family specialist. They're typically younger staff, but their role is not just to partner, but to be, frankly, what they get to do is all the things other team members won't or can't. If we need to get up and get Johnny to school in the morning, the younger staff tend to get drafted for that, and they like to have that capacity. It does mean some things, though. before we get excited about thinking about building big staff teams to do wraparound, the drawback is just around team. When you meet a family in California who's had wraparound as a provider as a wraparound provider who comes to the door with a coordinator, 2 peer partners, a child and family specialist, a therapist, etc., and then say who else should be involved, most families with any sense at all say, I think you guys might be enough, because you've just been overwhelmed by 4 people who show up to be helpful. They're really good at accessing and doing things fast for families. Not so good at building teams that last because there's so many of them. I don't know, Dave, if you want to add anything with your experience or where you guys are developing around these roles at this point.
Well, I think one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking about the different positions is, first of all, if some of you are in counties where you're just, you know, at the very beginning of considering even putting wraparound capacity in place, don't look at that and feel like, oh my God, we got to have all that in place to get started. But at the same time too, though, one of the challenges you may meet, and I was thinking about, I didn't know if you had any suggestions around that, Neil, is that in terms of having that supervisor position covered, or whoever does that, if it's an already existing position within the organization, is that if a county's just starting out, there may not necessarily be somebody who has that past experience with wraparound.
Yeah, and so we've done some things in this state because of that reality. And one of them is we've tried to offer some training on a regular basis for folks. Mm-hmm. The second, and hopefully more germane thing, is we've built a series of learning communities, which is a term for access to a meeting that happens across counties and across regions, where people who do wraparound can get together and do some information sharing and troubleshooting with each other. And while that's not direct supervision, we've tried to support quality practice in that way. I've actually known of a number of situations in which counties have considered, nearby, I don't know, not necessarily contiguous, but nearby counties have considered sharing supervisory capacity or responsibility. And that it really depends on the relationship in the county. But Dave, I appreciate your highlighting that, because one of the concerns I have for us as a state in our history, and again, the future is going to change this for us, is that we have a fair number of people doing wraparound without a strong tie to a supervisor who has a strong sense of the process. And we're not the only place in the world that has that challenge, but thinking about that's important. Around the staffing roles, there's a couple of issues. One is at some point, and in some of the TA conversations I've been a part of, the follow-up to these individual county conversations, I've asked folks to think about this. But one of the questions is, if you look out 3 to 5 years, how much capacity for wraparound do you need? There's a question of what do you have, but the other question is, if you look out 3 to 5 years, how much might you actually need? And you can get there by thinking about, okay, 8 to 10 or 10 to 12 or 10 to 15 families per facilitator on a full-time equivalency basis. You can also get there in some other ways by thinking about, John Vandenberg for decades has talked about, let's think about the incidence rate. Let's think about the rate of population, general population that ends up in care or in connection to services for our service systems. And that typically is somewhere between 9 and 18%. Depending on whose study you read. And then let's look at the top 1 to 5%, and you have to kind of decide how big a piece of that do we want to take. But that can begin to give you a number of the families that might be in need, the premise being that if we look at the needs of our most complicated kids and families, use wraparound to create alternatives and improved outcomes, it might actually, in the long run, allow us to redeploy some resources, because the fact is, for those most complicated youth and families, we spend the biggest part of our budgets across systems on a small number of folks. And if we can get different answers and different outcomes. At any rate, one question.
Oh, Dave. Go ahead, Neil. Were you looking at Jen Coleman's comment there?
Not yet.
Oh, okay. And big Jennifer, are you there? Oh,
Yep, I'm here.
oh, hi, Jennifer. Good to see
Hi.
you. You want to go ahead and just ask that real quick?
Yeah, so in Madison County, Neil, we've tried really hard since implementing like high fidelity wraparound and trying to keep it high fidelity where there's like neutral facilitation to kind of blend the family view and the community view along with our professional clinical perspectives and how we write plans. And here lately, it's been a huge problem because we're hearing when we're going to ask for funding for these things that no, your facilitator and your care coordinator are the same person, it's the same role. So you can't bill separate rates for those two folks on a wraparound team. I mean, is anyone else having issues with that?
Who are you hearing that from?
I don't think she's on here. So Jenny over at the Office of Family and Children, when we're submitting our MSY applications.
Okay, so it's related to MSY funding. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
I was kind of thinking with Ohio Rise coming, is this going to continue to be a problem with the definition of that role?
Well, one of the issues that's going to emerge, absolutely, and Jen, you put your finger on it early through the MSY issue, is how do current efforts around, what's the relationship between our current effort of wraparound in a given county and Ohio Rise? And there are structural issues around, what's the role of FCFCs in how that plays out? What position do FCFCs want to have about that? But on a very practical level, one of the questions that has to be answered is if you're a family, for example, in Ohio Rise, and you get referred for moderate care coordination informed by wraparound or intensive care coordination with high fidelity wraparound, and you get assigned to a family and discover that they're already involved with an FCFC wraparound effort, if it were me, I would roll up, so to speak, and meet that facilitator and say, dear God, please tell me what you know and tell me how I can help you, as opposed to starting an entirely different process. But that's, that's my brain going, well, why would you recreate the wheel? There will be permission issues around that because of the way money comes, so to speak. And there will be questions to answer about, it's kind of like who's in charge, who's the lead stuff, if two efforts to provide wraparound are happening out of different pathways, so to speak. And I would like to tell you that those things are resolved and that we've developed that somebody's developed a really logical way to make that decision, but I don't know that. And I haven't seen, for example, in the draft rules around RISE, nor have I heard of any FCFC who've talked through this and thought through about it from a kind of policy or procedural perspective in terms of saying how should those two roles relate to each other. And that's one of the unintended consequences of the excitement of being able to add capacity. I mean, the big question is, so how do Ohio Rise and existing efforts, how do any FFPSA funded activity, how does MSY in terms of those dollars stay involved in the picture? Because presumably that's still going to be a part of what's out there. Those are questions that I think need to be asked and answered. And my request would be that the counties participating in this process begin to talk about what you think makes sense. Not because you get to be in the driver's seat, but because if you don't think about how you want to have it work, you're going to end up having it work the way somebody else decided. And I just worry a little bit that somebody else might not have the same knowledge of our county systems as people who are involved in the wraparound discussions that exist already do.
Right. Thanks, Neil.
It's a great issue, a great question.
One last thing I'd add too, because I think with the slide before this, where you have HR staffing, it kind of, it may give the impression that you have to hire all these people on board. And what I wanted to just mention real quickly is we've been doing our work. One of the things that's been really nice about being part of this is seeing that there's a number of different organizational models for wraparound across the counties that are doing that right now. So like in our county, for instance, it's more of a centralized model where we have the supervisor and staff internal at Family and Children First. But in other counties, it's more decentralized where they have maybe the supervisor at council, but then the staff are dispersed through, are part of the staffing within different organizations. And so, you know, same thing too, like, you know, do you contract out or do you bring in house the parent partner piece or peer support piece? And so I think those are some of the questions you really want to weigh out, and you know, what's going to work best for your county too.
To Dave's issue, the next bullet in this slide tries to raise that question in terms of saying, we may never have all the roles I just described in an Ohio county. Mm-hmm. And you can do wraparound without it. You know, I mean, you can do wraparound with a facilitator, and that facilitator can be somebody who understands the process and has learned to do it well and has the ability to manage a group full of people who likes to wrangle cats and enjoys that. But the question that Dave's posing is, which do you have now, or would you start with? And if you don't have them all, is there an order in which you would build that capacity, and why would you do it in that order? Would you look for youth peer supports because you have an extraordinary opportunity? Would you look for tying a clinician to this? What you would decide to do next in terms of that is one of the questions to be thinking about around the staffing and HR stuff. The other issue that we've touched on in a couple of different ways is, would you look for one doorway, or would you be happy if there were multiple doorways to wraparound in your county? And for me, that's an important choice. One doorway gives us the opportunity, obviously, to be a little more centralized and a little more consistent and a little more clear about what we're looking at in terms of policy and procedural challenges. Multiple doorways may make it easier and may build our easier to get to for families because they can get it through a place they already are, so to speak. But you raise then the issue of kind of cross within our own community, cross-system consistency around what wraparound looks like. As Dave described, that decentralized model that really has lived longest in Trumbull, but it's not the only Trumbull County in the northeast. But it's not the only place it's lived. They've had to work at staying consistent across locations intentionally. So depending on how you answer the locations question, then what do we do around authority and support? What do we do around practice guidance and developing expertise? What do we do around making sure those partners and teams work well? Around parent partners, we've seen counties and facilitators, we've seen counties with centralized facilitation capacity, access, NAMI, and PAC, which is very decentralized and different. There are counties in which there are parent partners attached to the FCFC effort around wraparound. One of those is Butler. There are counties where that capacity around having a family support partner is located in an entire other agency. In Claremont County, it started in a family-run organization that they happened to be able to connect to as they built their capacity over the years. So different structures give rise to different challenges around how we manage the staffing and HR side of having effective teams on the ground. A couple of notes before we finish talking about the HR stuff and move to thinking about services. There are some staffing issues that aren't about the facilitators and the staff roles, and there's just a couple of them to talk about here. One is, what do we do to make sure system staff who are working with families have the right information about wraparound? That impacts everything from referral to the ability to participate in teams. We have to be aware that going out and telling people once probably isn't enough, because we have turnover and we have other system realities, like people move up the line or move across the systems, et cetera, et cetera. Dave and I have talked about that in Lucas County in a variety of ways for several years now, because it seems like an ongoing battle rather than a one-time issue. How do we get the right information to the right staff so that we minimize the kind of misconnects that happen around what the messages that families hear? The classic is an example in my life of getting to go with a facilitator as they met a family for the first time in pre-COVID times. And as they knocked on the door, the parent literally jumped up and down and clapped her hands and said, "Oh, goody, you're the guys who are going to get them up and get them to school." And we kind of looked at each other and thought, no. I was like, no, I live in Ohio, probably not. I mean, I want to be honest with you, I'm probably not going to do that. But it was around, not that was a wrong thing for the parent to say. It was just around what were the expectations, what was the information she heard, and how did it get delivered. Second bullet's around, we got to find a way in terms of thinking about what our staffing pattern and information patterns look like, to think about how are the policies and procedures of our work aligning with these things. Third, do we have good pathways around families being able to participate in staffing conversations? And some of that's design, evaluation, feedback. Some of that is things like, did we think as we go to hire, have we created ways for families to be involved in the selection process? If we're really serious about family voice and choice as a principle that drives our work, there's an example or an opportunity in terms of how that might happen. There's a note in the chat box about knowing that we have 88 parent mentors that support parents during wraparound systems of care. I'm fascinated by that, and that happens to correlate with the number of counties. So I don't know if Jackie or Jacqueline, if you want to say more about that.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute.
Yeah, right.
That's a varying number. It isn't with every parent mentor, is not in every county. I sure wish it was, but it is a grant through the Department of Education that helps families of kids with disabilities or at risk of disabilities. So we go right along with the parents for anything that they ask us to go to. So I've gone to families with wraparound and systems of care. I've gone to court dates. It's primarily to support the parents with what they need to be able to provide the best education and the best start of life. And so we have grant funded parent mentors, we have federally funded parent mentors, and then we also have district funded parent mentors. So it's just, it's a big piece of what I do sometimes.
Well, it's a wonderful example or addition to the fact that there is a lot of conversation in many different systems about what's the role of support and what's the role of people with lived experience in supporting the efficacy of our efforts. And it highlights for me that there are a number of kind of parallel activities. And so as we think about them in our community, we got to be clear about what all of them are, and be clear about the differences, because there are some differences in capacity, and also begin to articulate what is it we want in our community in terms of the notion of peer support. In this state, I'm sorry, Dave?
Oh, no, I was just going to ask Jackie real quick. Are a lot of these, the peer supports you're talking about, hired through the ESCs?
It can be, the grant is fairly flexible. It can be through an individual's school district. In my county, I'm hired for the county and federally funded, but I'm hired through our ESC.
Oh, which county are you in, Jackie?
Champaign County.
Oh, with Lydia. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's varying degrees of how they've allowed us to have a great deal of flexibility to support the families as well as the schools. But we are constantly being trained by ODE, and then we also do our own professional development. And as anybody from Champaign County can tell you, I've been doing it for 20 years.
Excellent.
It's really nice to hear from you, Jacqueline. It's nice to hear in the chat box about Licking and Union County. I mean, what that says is this is not a foreign conversation. These are conversations about these roles that are developing in counties across the state. The challenge around system of care development is how do we keep all the pieces fitting together and not trip over each other? Because one of the observations I have about Ohio is we do have a tendency to put ideas out and see them develop across a number of different resources and sometimes different funding streams, and we don't always pull them together into kind of one. I don't want lockstep, but diversity is a great thing around how we do this. We just got to be aware of the fact that it feels a little splintered, so to speak. So we have school-attached partners. We have NAMI-attached parent advocacy partners in growing numbers across the state in certain regions. We have some individual county-based kind of family peer support programs. We have the emergence of adult recovery peer partners in systems. There's a lot of activity, and so it becomes important for us to have some sense of the different definitions and have some clarity about it.
Hey,
But
Neil,
thanks for adding that information.
related to the adult recovery peer supports, one of the things I was going to mention real quickly, and we have a Strong Family Safe Community grant that we work with 5 other counties with. And in the eastern counties, in those counties, we've been pretty successful working with the artisans out of Erie County. Yeah, and they primarily started as substance abuse and peer support, but have really broadened out into family and youth peer support too.
If you step back for a few seconds, it's a fascinating dialogue.
Yeah.
On the screen, and I will in a moment, since our attendance and participation is fairly stable, I'll upload these slides in a PDF that folks can download, and I'll actually put last week's or last month's there also in a moment. But while I do that, I was asked to just gather some quick reaction and to understand a little bit more who's participating in this call. So I'm going to put a poll up, and for those of you who are with us and not trying to multitask, if you would quickly answer. It's a poll about SDFC meetings in your community and whether you get to attend or how often you get to attend. So I'm going to put that up and ask folks to respond to that quickly. It's a little bit of a non sequitur, it doesn't follow, but we were interested in kind of seeing that about who was on these calls. So I'm going to launch that and ask you to do that. And while that's happening, I'm going to try to upload there you go. I'm going to try to upload the slides. And there really is no, I feel like I need to say, there's no like incentive or disincentive attached to your answers to this. We're just looking to have a sense of who's with us. All right, I may not be able to get this uploaded faster than you can respond, so give me half a second. I'd hoped I'd be faster at locating the file. So those 2 files should appear in the chat box. If you can't get them, contact either your local SDFC person or contact myself directly, and I'll make sure you can see my email at some point and we can send those to you. Thanks for your responses to the poll. Just so folks get to see, you should be able to see that on your screen if you want. If you aren't Zoom users, you should A, be able to see the poll, and B, you should be able to go to the chat box and click on either of those 2 files. If you got last time, that's fine. I'm just trying to make it easy for folks. But you should be able to click on those and they'll download to your computer, and you can print them and make a paper airplane out of it, whatever you might want to do. So we can see from this poll real quickly that the majority of us are, you know, that I don't know, add 56 and 22. 78% of us are there as often as possible. That's interesting. We appreciate your answer to that. I would like to just 1 second here. There we go. I would like to try to make this go away. Hang on 1 second here. There. I want to move on now, and I want to talk about and I appreciate the conversation, but I want to talk about this notion of needed services and supports. Wraparound is an organizing process. I'm worried that as we move forward into Ohio Rise and other efforts, that we might give up the notion that it's an organizing process and begin to think about it as an intervention or a service, but it's an organizing process. And therefore, it only works as well, so to speak, as the nest it lives in. And the nest it lives in has to do with our collaborative relationships. It's what we talked about last month. It has to do with our collaborative relationships, the quality and variety of services available, and the ways we respond when what we have is not what we want for families. So it starts with a couple of truths. Wraparound's only as good as the nest it lives in. Wraparound doesn't replace or supplant service. It's the glue that ties them together and shapes them differently. And if wraparound staff are the only people acting differently for a family, you haven't changed your system. And just, you know, kind of some truths about that. Wraparound has typically been targeted for families for whom we don't see good outcome from current efforts. In easy wraparound lingo, the phrase is, if you know what to do, if you have a plan, if you see a family and you think you have a plan, do the plan. If you're not sure what to do, wraparound can help you get to a different place with that family, because what you're doing when you decide to do wraparound is you're committing to create a highly individualized response plan. Some additional truths about our systems of care in our communities is that most of us don't have all the services we want in the right volume. Even if we have them, we sometimes can't have enough of them, so to speak. And even if it's close, it's still hard to get the right service to the right person at the right time in the right way, so to speak. That leaves people doing wraparound, and it leaves communities wanting support wraparound with a challenge. And that challenge is to figure out how to create the right access to the right thing for the right family at the right time. And some of that is about who's in your array, so to speak. We, I think, know in Ohio that small rural counties have fewer formally named services than Toledo, Columbus, etc. We also know, or I do, I think, from my experience, that places with fewer service resources have long histories of figuring out how to get something done, of bending the rules, changing the definitions, finding the way to get it done because it's the right thing to do. Versus in large urban communities where people can go, oh, that's somebody else's job. You know, and so there are advantages and disadvantages depending on size and what happens. But in the end, the question for wraparound developers and supporters is, what do we do about that? And the answer in a broad way that I want to get you to think about as you move forward with wraparound is acknowledging that in wraparound, we need to be able to do these three things. The issue is really around customization. How do we generate a highly individualized response that's different than what we were doing before for families who have the greatest needs and we've seen the least outcomes with? So this, I don't know, set of arrows, large arrow, whatever it is, attempts to say, look, there are, you know, you can see it in the bullet. Sometimes a service off the shelf fits the strategy for meeting the needs. Sometimes what we have fits perfectly. It's good enough. Sometimes when it doesn't, we have to change something about that. We have to tailor that service, and we can tailor that by time, we can tailor that by intensity, we can tailor it by location, we can tailor it by eligibility, changing who's eligible, we can change a variety of features of it, but sometimes we need to just adapt the service. And there are two stories from my life that have always illustrated this for me as kind of easy examples. One was one of the first families I was ever involved with in a wraparound team and plan here in the Columbus area. And at the time, we were seeing a child return from a lengthy out-of-home placement. There had been steep challenges in their lives for a long time. And as the team met, we recognized that it would be helpful if we could have somebody with some really good de-escalation skills and some really good teaching skills in the home at certain times of day. And we went, aha, we have a home-based program. However, the team identified, I can't ever remember, it was 13 or 15, but it was an odd number right around 13 or 15 hours in a week where having that capacity would be helpful. And our home-based program was authorized to provide only up to 5 hours in a week. So tailoring, or moderate customization, came when we got the funder to allow that family to be counted 1 month as 2 families and 1 month as 3 families in the census of families, so that they didn't have to put extra money in it. We just kind of we tailored access. So that's kind of an administrative tailoring about, volume and eligibility. The other example that always sticks in my head was the story of a young man who was 15, almost 16 at the time this happened. For lots of reasons, there was a team gathered around him. For lots of reasons, he had almost countless referrals to therapy over his life, from 9 until he was almost 16. And as the team met, they thought therapy would be good. His mother and he raised the question of, well, wait a minute, he's had a lot of this. And the conversation turned to, well, how would we make therapy work for him? I mean, if it's not his favorite thing to do, how do we make it work? How do we make it a stronger kind of connection? And seeing as he was 16 and seemingly pretty focused on the notion of driving and a driver's license, the notion that what he needed was a therapist who had a cool car and would talk to him about the car, at least for part of the time, seemed like the hook that might make it work. That was about tailoring in terms of who does it. Can we find the right person to do it? And the individualization came when the team sat and went, okay, now we know what we want. How do we get it? And the action planning was around, okay, who's getting in a car? Who's driving around to the kids' mental health agencies? Who's looking for a cool car? Who's going inside and praying it belongs to a therapist that we can get connected to this young man? And it eventually worked out. It was a nice little import car. I don't know if it was nice. It wasn't very exciting to me, but it was exciting to the young man and to the owner of the car. Comparatively young therapist with a comparatively cool import car that had some features that included loud, shaking sounds that would emanate from it, and lights and noise, and at any rate. Another example of tailoring. That allows us to use the usual and customary better in meeting the need for a family. Teams will need the capacity to truly individualize, to do high customization, to truly create an answer for one person, one family at a time. And the question gets to be, in designing our community system, how do we access that? Any of you working in FCFCs in service coordination and wraparound know that there are things called FCSS dollars, and that there's some rules around them that make some things possible and other things impossible. That's a part of an answer. The question becomes, how do we create a capacity for teams to see that they can step outside of kind of usual and customary and create something, and know that others, meaning funders, there'll be a way to get it done. Here's the deal. If you look at a wraparound plan and you don't see tailored or individualized, if you don't see moderate or high customization, you probably went through a planning process that didn't need to be a wraparound planning process. We landed right where we already were, or could have been, through a less complicated process. So a hallmark is we should be looking in our plans for customization, and we should recognize that across the life of a family's involvement in wraparound, teams will probably need to be able to tailor as well as create responses. And we should encourage that and look for that. The challenge as we build our systems is how do we do that? And how do we support that? And these are some examples of ways people have done that. One, we've identified flexible dollars and a way to access them. And typically we talk about those as pooled funds, a bank account, a line in a budget, where multiple sources, meaning multiple systems, have contributed some amount of money. What we know is flexible dollars or pooled dollars allow for flexibility and response that might not be present in other ways. We also know at this point that you don't have to have 5 million of those dollars. Sometimes 500 is enough. Probably not across a community, but yeah, it's not about there's a right number to have. It's about having some access to be that creative. It's about having some capacity to allow a team to be able to say to a team as a community, go find the answer that makes sense. We'll find a way to get it done. So what do you fund with those dollars? In our current world, sometimes it's placement. Sometimes it's individualized plans. Sometimes it's services we can't buy. Sometimes it's responses we create individually. Flexible dollars happen through a number of kind of doorways. One is pooled, which is I give you money and I put my hands back, or I have a less oversight role and FCFC or somebody else decides about it. Another is the notion of braided dollars, where we don't put them into one account, but we put them into one agreement and may transfer funds back and forth to make it happen. So there are these one-time agreements we do about placement costs or about service plans. One of the interesting questions is, if we have a history and capacity for creating one-time agreements for placement costs, how big a step is it to create one-time agreements for highly individualized plans for families that support created alternatives, these kind of possibilities? And I worry sometimes about telling stories, one, because of time, and two, because I worry that people take the story and get the story, not the process. But these individually created options for families can be anything from a team I knew who met a family who didn't have, and as in August, and as school was starting, they recognized that they didn't have the right shoes to be at school. That while the school might not send them home because there was something on their feet, it wasn't all that safe, et cetera, et cetera. So on one level, the individualization, the high customization, were the team strategies to go and get Payless shoes to donate a bunch of shoes. They went and visited every Payless shoe store in Columbus until they got enough shoes to shoe the family, so to speak. That was easy, didn't cost a lot of money, took some time. On the other end, around these individualized plans are highly complicated kind of arrangements that truly were built for one family at a time. A quick outline of an example. There was a family with a single parent. She says, I don't know what happened to the father. It was a woman who had 5 kids, all of whom were in custody. She was duly labeled, meaning both chemical dependency and mental health challenges in her life. All 5 of her kids were in placement, and that community set out to try to create more stability for those kids because the oldest was running away from placement all the time. They discovered that she ran to care for her mother. The next youngest under her was already beginning the experience of her second pregnancy, and so they were worried about generationally what was happening, and they said, we need to do something different. And the different turned out to be, it's a long conversation, but the different turned out to be, they decided to go find a house with 2 halves and move mom into one half. And of course, they had to find her and engage her. But after they did that, they decided that the best way we could do this was to find a house with 2 halves, move mom into one half, move essentially her chemical dependency and mental health recovery services to her, because she tended not to get there even when she left to go to the appointment. She'd leave with all the great things and she'd run into somebody she knew and that would be it. So you kind of had to move the services to her. In the other half of the house, they recruited and hired a couple who were looking to change their careers. It turned out the couple they found, she was a special educator, and he was a residential program manager, a PRTF manager in the state that they lived in. And they hired that couple and moved them in next door and said, when mom can be mom, she's mom, and when she can't, you are. And our goal is to let these 5 kids experience as much safety and belonging as they can with their mother, but to make sure that they don't end up any further at risk. Complicated, took money to do it. The fact is, we were fortunate through a little bit of mathematic manipulation to come in at a cost that was roughly $1.05 cheaper than the aggregate per diems of placing those 5 kids. But the trick was, somebody had to say, we'll get this funded, we'll pay for it. And so again, I'm trying to like portray there's kind of this range about what people need in terms of flexibility. Another way we can get the flexibility is building flexibility into contracts. We can think about the exceptions. We can do it on a single family basis, or we can do it, like the in-home example I gave you earlier, or we can anticipate it up front and begin to define things differently. The third is creating flexibility through management by exception. Many of you are managers of programs or resources, and I suspect somewhere in your history you might have bent a rule, maybe even shattered it to get something done for people, and that's a way to get to flexibility. It's a little less reliable and a little harder for teams to know and trust, so to speak. The other way we can get to flexibility is we can build a flexible response resource. Wraparound Milwaukee's genius was they got money from the systems affiliated with kids who came into Wraparound and put that in one box or one silo, so that silo could then say to the providers in their community, no, I don't want your contract for the service you provide. I want your commitment to build and respond to what our teams say we need. And so the question is, how do we build flexible response in more than one place in our systems? Comments, questions, additions? I'm afraid I haven't looked at the chat box in a bit, and Dave hasn't warned me, so I don't know if I've missed anything. No, okay. So this issue is a huge issue in terms of capacity building for Wraparound, and it's something to start to think about. And the good news is that we can define the terms of the conversation. The bad news is it gets more complicated by the fact that we're sitting at a juncture in time when multiple pathways or multiple streams of dollars are flowing in different ways. And we have to think about, out of those, where can we get the flexibility we need to be able to do some range of response for individual youth and families and the teams that support them. The answer isn't, if you don't have flexibility in dollars, you can't do wraparound. That's not the answer. Communities have figured out how to get things done in a variety of ways. It does make it easier for teams to see that the community systems are supporting their effort to meet the needs of a particularly complicated youth and family. With each session, last time we left you with some questions, 8 or 9. This time I'm leaving you with like 30, and I'm not going to read them to you, but some questions related to each of these 3 sections. So as you get the slides, you look at these, you may want to think about whether these are questions you want to raise or talk more about amongst yourselves, so to speak, whether you want to bring them up in your county-based TA conversations in terms of get to more detail and starting to think through some of the responses to this. We're going to jump to accountability in a moment, but we actually have another poll for you. Interested in your responses to this. This one is just asking, it's a rough attempt on our part because there are so many definitional issues about it. But I'm going to post a poll in a minute that says, to the best of my knowledge, my county supports customization in responding to individual family needs in the following way or ways. And if I set this up right, you should be able to check all that apply in this. And so the options are things like maintaining and allocating pooled funds, or encouraging flexibility within existing programs, or arranging one-time agreements for extraordinary costs And we're just interested in, again, what this group participating in this call sees as the pattern of response in your counties. This is not a scientific survey designed to tell us anything except something about who's here. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna launch another poll and ask you to take a moment to respond. You should be able to check all the apply, which might be none or might be, what, 4, 5.
It seems like I can only check one at a time. Is there one specific one that you'd rather us check if we can't check all of them?
I would pick the one that you really, and I apologize for that. It probably has something to do with the way I set up the poll, and I must have missed checking the right box. My apologies. So if you would pick the one, if you can only pick one, if you would pick the one that you use, that you see happen most often in your county. So change that from we do it in the following ways to this is the way we do it most often. And I do apologize for having incorrectly built that poll. I don't do it that often, so I'm gonna have to go back to school about that, so to speak. We'll leave it up for just another moment. Again, just a quick look at what people see about this. Okay. Nobody's voted in a month, so I'll end that and I will show you. So here, almost half of us are aware of maintaining and allocating pooled funds, which is different than half of the counties because we have different representation here. So again, thank you so much for that input. It really was not meant to be any kind of scientific answer to things, but just to get a sense of where people are, so to speak, around that and what works for you. So thank you very much for that. And I've lost control of my screen for a moment, so let me go back here and do this. The last area that I wanted to talk about this morning was the notion of accountability. And for this purpose, I would define it the way you see on the screen. Accountability is the process of understanding and communicating what we're doing and whether it makes a difference. There are lots of pressures around accountability. We've tried to move to being more outcome-based in our service decisions and in our service design decisions. There have been increasing demands for information for all of us from different systems and different resources. And regrettably, that doesn't always leave us able to articulate why what we're doing works or doesn't work and what its impact is on people. So this is just an effort to say, look, when you think about accountability, it's a huge topic. It's important politically, it's important in terms of information, it's important in terms of program management, but it's a huge kind of spread. So on the left, I chose to call them points of accountability. I could have thought about saying layers of accountability, but it's acknowledging that as when we do wraparound or any other service, particularly in a cross-system collaborative environment, we have accountability to the community as a whole. We have accountability to the system or systems that are supporting and participating in this. We have accountability related to the organization that houses and manages this, and we have accountability to individual families as well as families collectively. These are targets. They're also audiences for information that we need to be able to get and to give to people. I'm not telling you anything you probably haven't thought about it another day in your life. On the right-hand side, I think there are at least 4 levels at which we can begin to look at what information can we gather and what does it tell us around these 4 items. First is cost. And wraparound's a tough thing to cost. Any of you who funded wraparound facilitation or service coordination with FCSS dollars, you've figured out how to write a unit rate, so to speak, for that. And how they cost Ohio Rise will make a huge difference in terms of how it happens. But there is a question. How much does it take to get this done? And is it the right amount? That's the Goldilocks and the three bears. You can spend too much and not get good outcome. You can spend too little and get a great outcome. It's kind of that temperature thing. The point about these 4 features to me is that each represent areas we can get and gather information in, and they relate to each other. Satisfaction is the second area. Do people like how what we're doing is being done? That's families, workers, managers, it may even be political leaders. So there are different targets around satisfaction. You can't write one satisfaction survey and find everything you need to know about satisfaction. Third area is about the process of the notion of fidelity. Are we doing this in a way that we think is right? Does it match what we need it to match? And finally, impact. Can we describe how this is making a difference? And again, that might be in families and organizations and systems and in the community. I tried to think about how I wanted to kind of put this picture out here. And one of the options was to do like a 16 by 16 grid, so to speak, and go, here are all the different ways we can think about accountability. My point being it's layered. My point being, you might need to think about cost this year because you're starting, but you may end up needing to think about satisfaction because you're worried about, I don't know, why referrals aren't happening the way you thought they would in your community. The process or fidelity stuff, I think, has become around wraparound and many other services, a little bit of the holy grail about how do we rate how we're doing. And in the end, impact is the biggest issue in my mind, but that's because I tend to just want to make sure that we can talk about how has this made a difference for individual families? Does it add up to something different? So when we did the look at staffing positions, Dave's comment was, don't get caught, and he's absolutely right, don't get caught in thinking you have to do all of this the first day or even the first 5 years. I would say the same thing about this. Don't get caught thinking we have to do all of this all the time because it's too complicated and most of us don't have the human resource to dedicate to it. And if you do, please take a stab at it. But let's be clear that it's a system of activities rather than an event or a report. We should be asking ourselves, is there information we need about these dimensions for these audiences? And then we should be prioritizing which set of stuff we work on, so to speak. So do what you can now. Keep an eye on this notion that there's a whole system of activities around accountability. Keep building or adding and by accountability strategies, I mean measure, summarize, report, analyze. Measure cost, measure satisfaction, summarize that. Analyze that together as a group, meaning ask, what does this tell us? What does it suggest is happening in our community system or in our organization? Wraparound teams do that through the process of benchmarking, which is, answering the question, if we met this need, what would we expect to see? And then looking at whether that happens or not, and asking, what are we learning about why? Same thing at kind of the community and organization system levels around the broader effort in wraparound. Be really clear, if we don't measure from the beginning, we can't tell the whole story, meaning we need to be able to talk about how it was if we're looking for change, so we'll know something changed. I do think it can be easy to be overwhelmed, so to speak, by all these layers, and so just do some incremental implementation. Think about, is it an audience? Is it our, there are counties in Ohio where county commissions have invested in the presence of wraparound. So they may be a very important accountability target. What information do they want? Our first thought might be cost, but maybe what they really want is impact data. Just think through some of that. Think about whether you want to start at thinking about cost or about satisfaction. I mean, ideally, you could build kind of a system that looks at all 4 of those features, so to speak, and stacks or restacks or prioritizes them in different ways based on what's going on in your community. remember that we also probably have to think about measuring more than wraparound. Goes back to Dave's comment. But communities that stay in this conversation for a long time typically end up trying to ask and answer. So if we like these principles, whether it's the systemic care principles or the wraparound principles, how does that inform, and what do we do in each of our individual systems to increase the presence or the responsiveness to that principle? And that's part of this notion about you can't just measure wraparound. You got to think about how you measure something that relates to your whole community. Comments, questions? Additions from Dave? Rachel Sword was another of our team members who was here for a moment. She may have had to go. Can't see her because of the way my screen's configured at the moment. Any additions, Dave?
No, I think you covered that.
Okay, cool. This is the set of questions we're leaving behind for you to think about. And again, I won't read them all to you. You can read them. They'll be available to you if you downloaded the slides. If you didn't, we're getting to the last few minutes to do that, if you want to. Again, I divided it this time in terms of people, policy, and practice, just trying to think about some different ways to help kind of cut the questions. I realize that we've now left you with 30 or 40 questions in just the first two sessions. And haven't answered them, but have tried to provide ways for you to think about how you might get to an answer for your community in the context that you're working and living in at this point. This notion about I want to come back to the title. This notion about keeping values in as you build out, it takes intentional self-reflection. And I don't mean navel gazing. I mean group collective conversation about what do we see? What does it tell us? What are we going to do about it? So have a kind of keystone or central pattern around reflecting on how these principles are articulated in your work. It may be as simple as saying, in a family satisfaction survey, having a question that asks families to respond to, I felt like what people did for us was always tied to my strength, sometimes tied to my strength, never. I mean, it might be that simple. But find ways to keep these concepts in what it is you're asking and thinking about. Recognize that it's easy sometimes to decide what to do, but it's not necessarily easy to think about how that response aligns with the principles we say we want in place. When something happens, we move to fast decision making, both around individual families and around system design. When something happens, and again, it goes back to why did we start this series now, months from RISE and months from answers about all these different things? Because I think we do better when we don't have to respond quickly to complicated issues, when we can think about them and envision some of what we want. Dave already talked about my last bullet. He stole my closing line. He didn't need to, I'm just kidding. But it really is, wraparound's complicated and relatively expensive, and it takes a lot to do it well. So remember that what we're trying to do is change the conditions of our system of care so that we need less wraparound or things like it. We've been in this conversation in this state for a long time, and so I'm not, as I said, I'm not too worried about us running out of things to do, so to speak. But it's an important kind of backdrop or focus to what it is we're looking for.
So, Neil, one of the things I was thinking too that I'd ask all of you to think about, if you, because they'll get the copy of the PowerPoint, correct? Or already have.
I think Sharon sent it out, but it's also available in the chat box for people to download today.
Okay.
If you joined after I posted, while you're talking, David, I'll maybe repost them, because if people joined after I did that earlier, they won't be able to get them. So go ahead.
What I was going to say though, especially since this one gets a little bit more into some of the pragmatic issues around the staffing, and supervision, and those pieces, is if you and your team have any time at all, or even if you don't, if you have time yourself to look at it before you're technical assistance team meets with you this month. Just because then that way too, you know, to really kind of identify those issues that you really want to focus in on, or, you know, want to discuss more thoroughly or dig into a little bit deeper. So that way when we come out, figuratively speaking, or virtually speaking, I should say, that when we come out to meet with you, that, you know, we can dig right into those specific issues that are relevant to your county.
So feel free to look those over. If some of you are meeting together between now and the time that's scheduled, please take 5 minutes, and it might not need to be more than that, to just sort and prioritize. And if you want to be really slick, send that information to your TA partner, to our team, to Dave and Rachel and the other team members, myself and Janice, et cetera. And we can be better prepared to help structure a useful conversation. Everybody who's been participating in those, I think everybody's got their time, so to speak, for those follow-on conversations scheduled. And I'm not even going to attempt to tell anybody when they are, because there are too many of them, but you should be able to contact either one of the two team members, or we ask the FCFC director folks to be the kind of point around, the point person around information in your community. So if you're not sure when they are, you should hear from them directly, and somebody will be getting a link together, so to speak, for folks to be able to meet. I hope today was helpful. I look forward to seeing folks in the individual TA sessions. Feel free to be in touch with your TA team or any of us if you have questions around any of what we've presented. Thanks so much for your patience. And as I said, I hope this was a helpful conversation today.